Hello, it's Thursday the 16th of June and you're watching Scotland at 7 with Hugh Stewart in our Glasgow studio. Good evening, thanks for joining me. Okay, some top stories coming up in a couple of minutes, but first of all I'm going to give a daily update on Putin's illegal war in Ukraine, which today brings us to day 113. And today, French President Emmanuel Macron praised the heroism of Ukraine's army and people and said there were traces of barbarism from Russian forces after his visit to the Ukrainian town of Irpin, which was the closest Russian troops got to Kyiv in the early stages of the war. He and other European leaders visited the town before meeting with President Volodymyr Zelensky. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, the Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi and Mr. Macron all arrived in Kyiv after an overnight train journey from Poland. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said that the leaders of France, Germany and Italy should not be focused exclusively on weapons shipments to Ukraine. During their visit, Dmitry Medvedev, former Russian president and now deputy chairman of the Security Council of Russia, said the visit of the French, German and Italian leaders to Kyiv is of zero use, to quote his words. Ukraine has ignored the Russian ultimatum to surrender Severodonetsk, with Moscow controlling 80% of the embattled eastern city, which has become the focal point of Russia's advances in the east of the country. Serhiy Haidai, Ukraine's governor of Luhansk, has said that fierce battles are being fought for every house in Severodonetsk as Russia continues its attempts to capture that city in eastern Ukraine. Russia's chief negotiator Vladimir Medinsky said that Moscow was ready to restart peace talks with Kyiv, but claimed it had yet to receive a response to its latest proposals. Russia's combat force in the Donbass is highly likely operating in increasingly ad hoc and severely undermanned groupings, the UK Ministry of Defence has said in its latest report. An overnight Russia air-launched rocket strike hit a suburb of the northern Ukrainian city of Sumy, killing 4 and wounding 6. Denis Pushilin, the head of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, has called for all Russian cities, as he called it, in Ukraine, including Odessa, to be occupied by pro-Russian forces. Children born in Ukraine's Kherson region since the 24th of February will automatically receive Russian citizenship, according to a statement by the Russian-imposed authority occupying that region. Russia's Foreign Ministry announced new sanctions against 121 Australian citizens, including journalists and defence officials, citing what it calls a Russophobic agenda in the country of Australia. US President Joe Biden yesterday announced a new $1 billion arms package for Ukraine following appeals by Kyiv for more help on the eastern and southern fronts. NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said on yesterday that allies would continue to supply Ukraine with heavy weapons and long-range systems, with an agreement on a new package of assistance to Kyiv expected at the summit in Madrid later this month. The agreement would help Ukraine move from the old Soviet-era weaponry to what he called a more modern NATO standard gear. Okay, and now more on that visit of 3 European leaders to Kyiv today. So Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz, the French President Emmanuel Macron and the Prime Minister of Italy Mario Draghi have arrived in Kyiv today on their symbolic joint trip to show their support for Ukraine as it struggles to resist Russian advances in the east of the country. The 3 were pictured together overnight in a train from Poland used to transport high-profile guests to Ukraine, but little information was given about the details of the highly anticipated trip. It's an important moment. It's a message of unity we're sending to the Ukrainians, of support to talk about the present and the future, since the coming weeks, as we know, will be very difficult, Mr. Macron told reporters at the train station in Kyiv. The 3 leaders were greeted with air raid sirens in the Ukrainian capital as Russia continued to strike targets across the country. Local officials said on Thursday that an overnight Russian air-launched rocket strike hit a suburb of the northern Ukrainian city of Sumy, killing, as we said earlier on, 4 and wounding 6 people. We're here and we're focused. We're about to meet President Zelensky now to visit a war site where massacres have been committed and then to lead the conversations that are scheduled with President Zelensky. Mr. Macron added. Soon after the arrival, the three leaders were pictured visiting Irpin, that commuter town just a few miles from Kyiv, which was subject to some of the heaviest fighting in the first weeks of Russia's invasion. Romanian President Klaus Iohannis also arrived in Kyiv by train today and is expected to join the other three in talks with the Ukrainian leader. The visit comes as complaints grow louder in Kyiv about slow arms deliveries, with one official saying this week that Ukraine had only received 10% of the weapons it had requested from the West. Herr Scholz has become the main target of complaints, with Ukraine particularly unhappy with Germany's military aid. The country's ambassador to Berlin, Andrei Melnik, told the German broadcaster NTV that he expected Scholz to hand over heavy weapons which had been long promised but not yet delivered. The first joint visit from the leaders of the three largest EU economies is taking place a week before the EU summit, where European leaders are expected to discuss Kyiv's bid to join the 27-nation bloc. Mr. Macron previously tempered Ukraine's ambitions to join the EU by saying it could take decades for Ukraine to become accepted into the EU. Scottish news now. A decisive majority of the Scottish public recognise that there is a mandate for Scotland to hold a referendum. Evidence from the 2021 Scottish elections study addresses the question of whether the Scottish public thinks that the government here has a mandate to pursue a second independence referendum. The data shows that 61% of Scots think that the Scottish Government does have an IndyRef2 mandate. Right across the board, and every question asked, the study found that the majority of following the 2021 election, the majority of people in Scotland believed that there was a mandate for a second referendum. This data leaves unionist politicians increasingly isolated in their attempted denial of Holyrood's mandate to hold an independence referendum, following the STUC General Secretary Ros Foyer this week also acknowledging that the electoral mandate for the Scottish Government to conduct a debate over the second independence referendum. Commenting, the SNP's member of the Scottish Parliament, Michelle Thompson, said, "The Scottish Government has a cast-iron mandate to hold an independence referendum, and this authoritative survey shows that, by a decisive margin, the majority of Scots agree. This mandate was given little more than a year ago when the people of Scotland returned a majority of MSPs supporting a referendum, with more pro-independence MSPs than in 2011. Westminster politicians cannot brazenly deny the democratic mandate given to the Scottish Government in 2021, and their morally and politically bankrupt stance is not tenable." And Michelle Thompson went on to say, "It's for people, not politicians, to decide if there should be an independence referendum, and people across Scotland unsurprisingly recognise the mandate for IndyRef2 that last year's elections provided. The people of Scotland will have a choice of voting for a better future. The SNP will make sure of that. So it's time for the Westminster parties to stop denying the indisputable democratic mandate which exists and to start engaging in the substance of this debate." That was Michelle Thompson, MSP, talking about the report which says that Scottish voters accept that the general election result last May indeed mandates the Scottish Government to hold a referendum. Angus Robertson for the Scottish Government suggested yesterday that referendum would be in October 2023. Now, further on that, the SNP today has challenged the leaders of the pro-Westminster opposition parties to explain why they support continued Westminster control over Scotland's future when the UK is performing so poorly in relation to our European neighbours. The challenge comes after the launch this week of the first in a series of Scottish Government papers to refresh the case for independence. The SNP says that Douglas Ross and Anas Sarwar have key questions to answer, including why are independent countries of Scotland's size wealthier than the UK, more equal than the UK, and more productive than the UK? Commenting, the SNP's member of the Scottish Parliament, Rona Mackay, said, "Douglas Ross and Anas Sarwar continue to prioritise protecting Westminster control over the best interests of the people they are meant to protect. So the people of Scotland deserve an explanation from both Labour and Tory branch office managers." She said, "It's absolutely clear that Scotland is being held back by Westminster control and Brexit is making us poorer. It's also clear that the reason for that is that Scotland is tied to a failing Westminster system and denied access to the powers of independence. She said if Douglas Ross and Anna Sarwar don't agree, that's the reason they should explain why neighbouring independent countries of Scotland's size are wealthier, more equal and more productive than the UK. Okay, now on to the cost of living crisis. The UK government has been challenged to urgently rise to the scale of the cost of living crisis, hammering households after new research revealed that food prices could increase by 15% over the summer, forcing people to skip meals. The report by the Institute of Grocery Distribution, that's the IGD, warned that people will be forced to pay more for essentials including bread, dairy and meat. It's estimated that the average monthly grocery bill for a typical family of four will reach £439 from next January, a big jump from £396 the same month this year. I'll just go over those figures again. That's an estimate. Family shopping bill of £439 a month next January compared to £396 for last January. James Walton, the IGD's chief economist, stated, if average food bills go up by 10.9% in a year, a family of four would need to find approximately £516 extra per year. We are already seeing households skipping meals, a clear indicator of food stress. Commenting, the SNP's Shadow Chancellor Alison Thulis MP said, these grim warnings are the latest in a growing list as the cost of living crisis continues to spiral out of control, with households and businesses under increasing pressure. With people facing rising food and fuel bills and higher household bills, the UK government cannot sit back after its early support package and clean its hands of this crisis. It must urgently step up to the scale of the cost of living crisis, which is forcing people to choose between heating or eating. While measures announced earlier are welcome, it's clear that the Treasury must heed these latest findings and go further and faster to tackle the challenges, support households and put money into people's pockets. Alison Thulis continued, with Brexit playing a part in the cost of living crisis and the recent OECD forecasts that the UK is set to have the lowest economic growth performance of all the G20 economies, apart from Russia, it's clear that people in Scotland are being forced to pay a heavy price for the cost of living with Westminster. More on the economy coming up, The UK Central Bank, the Bank of England, has today raised interest rates for a fifth time in succession to tackle an inflation rate that's heading towards 11% amid soaring household energy bills. In a move widely expected by city economists, the bank's Monetary Policy Committee, that's the MPC, voted by a majority to increase its base rate by a quarter of a percentage point to 1.25% in response to the living cost rising at the fastest annual rate for 4 decades. It also said it was ready to act forcibly, as they put it, if required, signalling that further rate rises may be coming in future months. In a downbeat assessment, as the central bank attempts to navigate a narrow path between the flatlining economic growth and surging inflation, the Bank of England now expects the economy to shrink in the second quarter, while a further rise in household energy bills is expected to push inflation above 11% by October. In a split decision, a minority of 3 members of a 9-strong MPC pushed for a bigger 0.5-point rise amidst growing unease over persistently high inflation, as central banks around the world launch aggressive rate hikes to combat the rising cost of living. Reflecting fears about the rising cost of living as a COVID pandemic and Russia's war in Ukraine drive up global energy prices, the MPC said it was ready to launch a tougher response to inflation remaining above the target rate, which is 2%. However, the Bank of England's decision to stick to a quarter-point increase underscores concern over the strength of the UK economy following weaker growth readings in recent months, as the cost of living crisis erodes household spending power and businesses struggle with severe staff shortages and supply chain bottlenecks. Highlighting the growing risk of recession, the bank sharply downgraded its growth forecast for the second quarter of the year, cutting its estimate from a 0.1% rise in GDP during those 3 months to the end of June, now to an 0.3% decline. So it's a slowdown of the UK economy. Official figures showed that the economy unexpectedly shrank in April after a fall in March. UK households have faced a surge in cost of living this year, with inflation reaching 9% in April, and that's the highest rate in the G7 group of wealthy nations, following record increases in gas and electricity bills. Okay, and that brings us to a story about the UK National Rail strike, expected next week. The UK Rail Authority Network Rail said there was no real hope of avoiding the biggest UK rail strike in 30 years next week, as it told passengers to plan ahead and only travel if necessary. The strike days will be on the 21st, 23rd and 25th of June, and a special timetable will be in operation from the 20th to the 26th. The full timetable will be published on Friday, that's tomorrow, but several operators, including Southern, Northern and Transport for Wales, have already told passengers not to attempt to travel on those strike days. Network Rail is a nationalised organisation under the control of the UK Government's Department of Transport. The Scottish Government have regularly called for the management of the rail network in Scotland to be devolved. Network Rail confirmed that large parts of the UK would have no passenger services at all on those strike days, including locations such as Penzance in Cornwall, Bournemouth in Dorset, and all the Wales West or the north of Cardiff, with no passenger trains running north of Glasgow and Edinburgh. ScotRail staff are not involved in the industrial action, however, Network Rail workers in Scotland will be on strike. With backup staff for signalling, about 20% of trains will run on main lines and urban areas on the strike days, while services will start later in the morning, with about 60% of the schedule on the subsequent days. Network Rail's chief executive, Andrew Haynes, described the strike by 40,000 RMT workers as a high-stakes gamble by unions, and said it would cost the industry £150 million and make a pay increase harder. The RMT called for direct talks with the government, saying it was clear that the Treasury is calling the shots. Mick Lynch, the RMT's General Secretary, wrote to the Transport Secretary Grant Shapps to seek an urgent meeting, saying, in effect, in recent weeks the union has been negotiating with the government, but the government has not been in the room. The last meeting between the unions and government was with Rail Minister Wendy Morton back in March. The number of passenger services on the strike days is expected to be limited to about 4,500, compared with 20,000 normally. The last services between Scotland and London will leave by 2 p.m, while most intercity trains in England will have their final departure mid-afternoon. Okay, so it's an expected UK rail strike beginning next week. Okay, a story from America now. The US could have saved more than 338,000 lives and more than $150 billion in healthcare costs from the COVID pandemic if they had a universal healthcare system, according to a study. More than 1 million people died in the US from COVID, in part because of the country's fragmented and inefficient healthcare system, as it was described in the report, which meant that uninsured or underinsured people faced financial barriers which delayed diagnosis and exacerbated the transmission, according to this report. The US had the highest death rate from the virus among the wealthy large countries, and is also the only one among such countries without universal healthcare. It spends almost twice as much on healthcare per capita as the other wealthy nations, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation research. The current healthcare system in the US is economically inefficient and leaves millions of Americans without adequate access to medical treatment, said Alison Galvani, the director of the Centre for Infectious Disease Modelling and Analysis at the Yale School of Public Health. She was a lead author of the study, which is published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The authors recommend that the country should adopt Medicare for All, which would be a single-payer health care programme to, as they put it, facilitate recovery from the ongoing crisis and to bolster pandemic preparedness, as well as safeguarding well-being and prosperity more broadly. To determine how many COVID deaths were potentially preventable, the authors built upon previous studies of the insurance gap and mortality rate in the US, with data on how many people lost employment-sponsored insurance due to COVID-related business closures and restrictions which led to unemployment. The authors calculated potential cost savings from universal healthcare in part by reviewing the average Medicare and Medicaid costs for a COVID-19 hospitalisation which required mechanical ventilation. The cost came in at $57,000 and $47,000 respectively. However, the average charge to private insurance was $114,000. The study also asserts that the fear of losing health insurance during a pandemic might have caused people to still go to work even when they didn't feel well. Okay, we're now going to go to Netherlands for a spy story. In Amsterdam today, the Dutch intelligence service has said it has uncovered a Russian military agent attempting to use a false identity to infiltrate the International Criminal Court, that's the ICC, which is investigating accusations of war crimes in Ukraine. Sergei Vladimirovich Cherkasov created an elaborate cover story dating back years to try and enter the Netherlands as a Brazilian national for an internship in the Hague-based ICC in April, according to Dutch intelligence. This was a long-term, multi-year GRU operation. The GRU is Russia's military intelligence service. This GRU operation must have cost a lot of time, energy and money, said the Dutch intelligence agency chief, Erik Akkerboom. There was no immediate reaction from Moscow, although President Vladimir Putin's government's standard response is to dismiss spying accusations as a Western smear campaign against Moscow. The Dutch General Intelligence and Security Service, AVID, said that in a statement that the man who went by the alias of Victor Muller Freire was picked up at a Dutch airport. He was then declared an undesirable alien and put on the next flight back to Brazil, where he faces court proceedings, it added. ICC spokesperson Sonia Robles said that the court was grateful to Dutch authorities for the operation and the exposing of security risks. The ICC takes these threats very seriously and will continue to work and cooperate with the Netherlands, she said. The Dutch agency said it had taken the unusual step of releasing detailed information on the case to expose the workings of Russian intelligence and threat to other international institutions. It distributed a 4-page document outlining what it said was Cherkasov's invented cover story. That included a supposed troubled family history and details from a club where he liked to listen to electronic trance music and his favourite restaurant in Brasilia where he would eat cheap brown bean stew. Okay, that's an elaborate cover story there from the world of espionage. Bean stew. Eh? Now, the Scottish Government today, Scottish Parliament today, Lorna Slater, the Economy Minister, the Circular Economy Minister, faced questions on incineration, and she has a statement. The Circular Economy Minister has set out the action that will be taken to deliver on the recommendations of an independent review of the role of incineration. In a ministerial statement to Parliament today, Lorna Slater confirmed that the Scottish Government has accepted all 12 recommendations, including Dr Church's recommendation that no further planning permission for incinerator facilities should be granted. New national planning policy will be introduced through the National Planning Framework No. 4, which will be presented to the Scottish Parliament for approval later this year. This policy will make clear that the Scottish Government does not support the development of any further municipal waste incineration capacity in Scotland, with very few exceptions. In the meantime, a notification direction will remain in place requiring local authorities to alert the Scottish ministers of any new planning applications which involve incinerators. A similar notification direction was previously used, and successfully, to give the effect of a moratorium on unconventional oil and gas, otherwise known as fracking. Circular Economy Minister Lorna Slater said, "Reducing waste and recycling what we do produce is the key to tackling the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity and ensuring that we all enjoy a healthy environment. That's why we are taking action to create a circular economy in which materials are kept in use for as long as possible and precious natural resources are not wasted." And Lorna Slater also said, "We also need to make sure that we manage unavoidable and unrecyclable waste in the short term. By putting in place sensible measures to limit and gradually reduce Scotland's incineration capacity, we can make sure that we can manage our waste today while ensuring our future waste infrastructure aligns with our climate targets." that was the Circular Economy Minister Lorna Slater, who made a statement on no more incineration, which was delivered to the Scottish Parliament earlier on today. Now another Scottish story. We find today that over 90% of graduates from Scottish universities have gone on to find work or further study after finishing their courses. That's despite the impact of the pandemic. The latest HESA Higher Education graduate outcome statistics, which are from 2019-2020, show that the proportion of graduates in work or further study is 90.1%, and that's 2 percentage points up on the previous year, although the impact of COVID-19 and cohort changes has impacted on comparisons. The latest figures show that 70% were in work, 11% were in work and further study, while 9% were in further study only. Just 5% were unemployed, that's 15 months after graduating, and that's down from 7% the previous year according to the survey. For those graduates in full-time work, 72% were earning over $24,000, that's 15 months after their studies, and that's an increase in last year again. In addition, 89% agreed or strongly agreed that their work was meaningful. So that's 43% strongly agreed and 46% agreed with the statement that the work they're now doing is meaningful. Higher Education Minister Jamie Hepburn said, "Our universities are among the best in the world, and these statistics show that we are continuing to produce a highly skilled graduate workforce, which will maintain our economic competitiveness as we emerge from the pandemic." Okay, those were the stories which we noted earlier on this afternoon as we prepared the programme, but we have something else that's just come in now, and this refers to the miners' strike of the 1980s, which of course was before the Scottish Government's current existence. Nonetheless, today the Scottish Parliament has passed a pardon bill for miners who were prosecuted during the strike. So this key legislation will pardon former miners of certain offences. Now, Scotland has become the first of the 4 home nations to pardon former miners convicted of certain offences relating to strike action in the 1980s. Historic legislation was passed by MSPs, and it ensures a collective and automatic pardon for miners who've been involved in strike action, which also extends to members of the miner's household and other close family members who may have been convicted. The legislation was recommended by an independent review led by John Scott QC, and it has the impact on the impact of policing in Scottish communities during the miners' strike. The Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Veterans, Keith Brown, described this legislation as groundbreaking and said that the UK government should now give consideration to a UK-wide public inquiry into the strike and into compensation for former miners. Keith Brown said the miners' strike was one of the most bitter and divisive industrial disputes in living memory. He said that this landmark judgment in the Scottish Parliament should help to heal wounds with Scotland's mining communities. Mr Brown said this new decision by the Scottish Parliament will restore dignity to those convicted, and he said he hopes will bring closure and some sense of justice for members of the mining communities. He also said that he very much sympathises with miners who lost out on redundancy payments and on pension rights as the result of being sacked by the National Coal Board after being arrested or convicted. And of course, those convictions are now effectively quashed. By securing this pardon, Keith Brown says we've done what we can within our powers to restore dignity to individuals who meet the qualifying criteria. He says it's now up to the UK government to recognise the passing of this legislation and call for a UK-wide public inquiry into compensation for former miners. He says he has written to the Home Secretary now urging her to consider her position given the strong support for this landmark bill. Adding to this, Professor Jim Murdoch, who's from the School of Law at Glasgow University, who worked with Mr Scott QC, said, as members of the independent review, our task was primarily to listen to show that those affected by the miners' strike had a voice more than a third of a century later. At each of the meetings, he said it was clear that the pain felt by former miners and their families was still raw. In response to the response to the miners' strike at the time, he said, left a deep scar on too many communities. Their stories showed that without doubt, the criminal justice system all too often reacted in an arbitrary and disproportionate manner. And finally, Nicky Wilson, the President of the National Union of Mine Workers in Scotland, said the NUM welcomes the passing of the Miners' Pardon Bill. It removes the stigma of a criminal record given to miners who were striking to save their industry, save their jobs and communities, which led to convictions and sackings. Okay, so that was the Miners' Pardon Bill, the Miners' Strike Pardon Bill, agreed today by the Scottish Parliament. So that's it for tonight, just a short story, short programme. So thank you to Ruth for doing the show yesterday, and I think Andrew's going to be here tomorrow, so please watch Scotland at 7 every weekday at that hour. So that's it for me tonight, but just let me just return to our familiar theme, of course, which is how to finance Broadcasting Scotland. And if you agree with us in the studio that Scotland really needs independent broadcasting, particularly as we now know that the independence referendum will be in October 2023, according to the Scottish Government yesterday. We need independent broadcasting, that's why we're here, and I know that many of you agree with that. Also, we found out today that many of you have contributed generously to our emergency fundraising appeal. The fundraiser is on our website. If you look at www.broadcastingscotland.scot, you'll find on there our emergency fundraiser to get through our immediate difficulties with trying to pay the bills. I'm glad to say a lot of people have really responded, and that's tremendous. It really is great to see the money that's coming in. In fact, we're over 60% of the way towards our target, so that's great. We have extended the emergency fundraiser through to next Monday, so hope we can just get a wee bit more in to get us over the line. But really, it's great to see that we are not alone here. The money coming in shows a lot of people do agree with us that we need independent broadcasting in Scotland, and I think over the next 18 months or so, that need is going to become more apparent. So thanks a lot, guys, but if you can do a wee bit more, we really would appreciate it. So if you have contributed, the other thing you could do, of course, is to spread the word. It really would be great if we could double the number of people regularly watching and contributing to our programmes. We'd love to be able to double the programme output, and if we can get more help, both in financial form and help of any other volunteers who would like to help around the studio, let's get this thing going. Let's get proper independent broadcasting and make sure that Scotland's issues are properly discussed from our point of view and not seen through the lens of broadcasters based elsewhere. We are free to air, of course, but we do need your help, and that's entirely voluntary. So it's great to have your money coming in, but we can't force you. Unlike some broadcasters, we don't demand money with menaces. But it's great to have you on board. So finally, thanks for watching tonight. We'll be back at Scotland at 7 tomorrow. All the best now. Bye.